There's 10 years left really to save Britain. We have, and the great irony is of course Antifa, all these anti-fascists allying themselves with the great fascist force of the day, which is radical Islam, which is the true fascism of our time. Muslim youth are far more radical than their parents or grandparents.
The Jews, the man are gonna get beheaded one by one, dirty Jews.
1/3 of young Muslim youth aged 16 to 24 believe you should be put to death for apostasy. Same thing in terms of believing you shouldn't teach music in schools, that girls should have the burqa in schools, criminal offence to show a picture of Muhammad. But too often people say, oh, it's only a fringe minority who hold these views. It's not a fringe minority, it's a very large minority. 15% in the latest poll have a favourable view of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so forth. 9% of Muslims believed that they were supported or identified as being jihadis or extremists. 9% is 400,000 people. We have 40,000 Muslims on the terror watch list in this country, kept by MI5. 40,000 people, to put that into context, that's larger than Hamas on October the 7th when they went into Israel. It's larger than the size of the ISIS army in 2014 in Iraq. That's who we have here. It's half the size of the full-time British Army. And when you look at the fact that the Muslim population is forecast to double, perhaps even treble by 2050, that means you're going to have 120,000 people on the terror watch list, which is larger than the British Army, and you're going to have perhaps over 1 million people in this country who identify as being jihadis, which is actually larger than the American army.
My name is Stefan Tompson. I'm the founder of Visegrad 24, and I'm here in London with Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, a historian, a political commentator, a member of the New Culture Forum. Rafe, great to have you in part 2.
A pleasure to be back with you.
Rafe, let's go straight into it. And we saw what happened at the election. There is a rise in Muslim independent candidates being elected in councils. Talk me through what's happened and why this is happening.
Well, what we're seeing is quite fascinating, actually. I mean, we're seeing obviously the flexing of Muslim muscle, of radical Islam within the UK. It's been a long time coming. There's been a gradual process of recruitment and solidifying of their base, and now they feel that they're in a comfortable enough position to try to essentially make their stamp in the political world. But what we're seeing actually is a schism within the Muslim community. For the past few decades, Islam has been embedded with the Labour Party. One of the reasons the Labour Party wanted mass migration was to introduce a new demographic into this country, because 80% of ethnic minorities used to vote for the Labour Party. They thought we could flood the nation with a new demographic and guarantee Labour majorities into the future. And certainly if you look at places like London and elsewhere, these have become one-party Labour states. Unfortunately, as always happens when you make major decisions on the back of an envelope, no one thought about the long-term consequences. And Muslims are no longer voting for the Labour Party in such great numbers. And what we've seen over the last few years was a move away towards independent Muslim votes. They have a few MPs in Parliament who are independent Muslim candidates. But now what they've realised is the Muslim vote share is still too small for them to get enough Muslim candidates elected on their own bat. So they're slightly abandoning the independent Muslims, and they're using a vehicle, a Trojan horse, in the form of the Green Party. And that was the big story of the last local election, was how the radical Islam has infiltrated the Green Party, which used to be a very left-wing environmental party. And if you looked at the last election campaign, there was nothing about the environment. It was a completely different party from the one that we used to know, and it was more concerned about Gaza and about the usual issues which concern the far left and radical Islam. And the reason for that is quite simple. The older Muslims are still sticking with the Labour Party. These are more assimilated Muslims, they're more part of British culture, but it's the youth and the radicalized youth and the more extreme elements within Islam that have now tacked themselves onto the Green Party. And, you know, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union used to call far-left activists in the West Polenzi Duraki, the useful idiots. And I'm afraid, once again, as we saw in the Iranian Revolution, the same left-wing useful idiots are being used by radical extremists in Islam to get what they wanted. And quite why people in the Green Party can't see this boggles the mind, because the Green Party in Britain is led by a gay Jew. And you would think that that might send up some flags as to why so many extreme Muslims have now come on board this party. About a quarter of Muslims in many of the dense areas in Britain are voting for the Green Party. Up to, I think, 40 or 50% of Muslims said they would vote for the Green Party to block the Labour Party. So that's what we're seeing. You know, there's been a great realignment in politics in the West. You've seen it around Trump and his voting base. In Britain, small c conservative working class people voting for right-wing parties. But that same realignment has now happened within the Islamic community in Britain, and they're now using other parties as vehicles, because only if they combine their vote with the white vote can they get their people into power.
So Rafe, I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but how do you reach this stage where, how did the Muslim community organize to take over the Green Party? How did they select the Green Party as opposed to they used to vote for the Labour Party? In fact, Tony Blair, to bounce back on what you were previously saying, Tony Blair openly admitted, I believe it was a few months ago, said that they opened the floodgates of migration to rub it into the Tories' nose. There's a on-camera statement of Tony Blair.
No, well, it was a chap called Andrew Neither, who was a speechwriter to Barbara Roach, who was the immigration minister, who wrote an article for the Evening Standard, and it was one of those moments when you got a glimpse behind the curtain into the thinking of the people who actually unleashed on Britain the greatest act of harm in our history, mass migration. And there they clearly said the motivation was to rub the right's nose in diversity. And that was it, and to flood the nation with a whole new demographic.
So why did the Muslim community not pick the Labour Party to slowly but surely take over? Why go for a vehicle like the Greens? And then my follow-up question to that, if you could also address that, is there a coordinated approach through mosques and Muslim community centres pushing currently the Muslim minority and Muslim majority in some councils to vote for the Greens? Is it a coordinated operation?
Yeah, so what's happened is over the last few decades, as I've said, there has been a hand-in-glove relationship between the Islamic community, or large elements of the Islamic community, because nothing is obviously a monolith, and the Labour Party. And essentially, the Labour Party has said to them, there's no point voting for other parties like the Green Party and others, because they will never get into power. We are the only other party of government apart from the Conservative Party. The Tories won't ever be in power to help you. The other parties are too small. We are the ones who will look after your interests. And that's been the way that it's worked for a long time. And that's why, for example, the Labour Party turned a blind eye to the rape gangs, to the industrial scale rape of young British girls across the breadth of this country. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of girls raped in towns like Rotherham and all across the north of England and elsewhere. And the councils, the police and local politicians turned a blind eye to all of this in order not to offend the Muslim vote and lose that demographic vote. That was a very closely, relationship worked very well. But then what we saw within the Labour Party in the last few years was a desire to rid the party of anti-Semitism and to put the more radical elements of the Labour Party onto the backbenches. So there was a bit of a schism and a civil war within the Labour Party. And suddenly it no longer became an obvious vehicle for radical elements in the Muslim community. And there was a lot of backlash against the Labour Party also because of the war in Gaza and this perceived support of the Labour Party and the government for Israel. And because of that, there was a desire to go elsewhere. So originally they went to have their own independent Muslim MPs, but then they decided they needed to have the Green Party. And they chose the Green Party because it is, in many ways, their natural alliance, because it is a party of extremists. It's the extreme left, but there is a combined, there's something very similar between radical Islam and the far left, and that's they are both utopians. They both believe in a utopia, but to achieve their paradise, of course, it means repression, it means oppression, and usually in the case of the far left and Islam, it means the deaths of millions potentially. But it is that desire to create a nirvana by the oppression, by an end to free speech, and by coercion. And so they are, in a weird way, natural bedfellows. And they realize that the far left in this country are so blinded in their hatred of the right and in the ideology of progressiveness and woke, that they cannot see any evil by people of color. So they cannot see a dark side to radical Islam, in the same way they don't believe black people can be racist, for example. And so they will not, and that's why you have movements like Queers for Palestine, right? I mean, talk about turkeys voting for Christmas. I mean, the one thing you can say about Gaza is there are no tall buildings left in Palestine to throw any gay people off. But it's this bizarre element you have on the left where they seem willfully blind to the fact that the people they've allied with are actually their worst enemy. And one of the things that people like myself on the right is to say, look, we're not radically right-wing. We want to preserve in this country a liberal society. We believe in women's rights. We believe in gay rights. We believe that Jews should be able to walk freely on the streets. The people you've allied with are the ones who want to oppress women, kill Jews, and kill homosexuals, and they can't see that. But they were natural bedfellows, and that's why you've seen that, because radical Islam isn't yet in a position where they can elect sufficient numbers to power without the support of these useful idiots on the left. So that's why they've chosen the Green Party as their vehicle. And the Green Party elite, they know full well what's going on, but they're so hungry for power that they are deliberately turning a blind eye to all of this. And so you're seeing them, for example, now in favor of, England has more laws protecting animals than protecting children, famously. We are the world's great animal lovers. Dogs are at the central part of life in this country. And yet you're now seeing the Green Party saying, for example, dogs should be on a leash at all times in the countryside, or you shouldn't be allowed to bring dogs into other places. And that's deliberately a way that they're trying to placate and win over the Muslim vote. And now, for example, Brighton has the highest gay population percentage-wise in Europe, and they've now got an Orthodox Muslim mayor through the Green Party. I mean, quite frankly, how comfortable he is leading the Pride Parade, I have no idea, but just goes to show you the weird world, this weird alliance we have. And the great irony is, of course, Antifa, all these anti-fascists, allying themselves with the great fascist force of the day, which is radical Islam, which is the true fascism of our time.
So you reckon that the elites of the Green Party, the leaders of the Green Party are well aware of what they're doing and they need an ally? And because the one thing that does also unite them is that in order to be able to usher in their utopias, they have to tear down the current order. They can't achieve their goals without tearing down liberal democracy, without tearing down rule of law, without tearing down the institutions. They have to demolish it all to be able to build on the ashes of that. So you think, do you think the Muslims, so we have obviously two camps here, the Red-Green Alliance, where ironically the Greens are the red, and
the Green Alliance.
In this case, the Green Alliance, but as it's referred to by academics, the Red-Green Alliance. The Muslims, or the Islamists rather, who are embracing this alliance, they are not naive about what they're doing. They are well aware of the intent, that this is a marriage of convenience, right?
Well, when you are marching next to someone with green hair and a ring through their nose, it's pretty obvious that you're not on the same side politically, and that this is a marriage of convenience.
But yet you say that the Greens, the radical Greens, don't necessarily know this.
No. I mean,
so it really is.
This is an age-old story, isn't it? We've got so many examples of people on the left welcoming asylum seekers into their house and then getting raped by those same asylum seekers. There are so many examples of the willful ignorance and willful blindness of the left, who simply cannot see any fault in people who they think and believe are oppressed, simply again because they don't believe that they have sacralized asylum seekers. They have sacralized or made sacred certain communities, including the Islamic community.
Why do you think they've done this?
Well, also I should say they're also united in their anti-Semitism. It's another thing that connects them too. So issues like Gaza, for example, have united them. In essence, it comes down to a nihilism. There is a nihilism on the left, and there is a self-hatred and a self-loathing, and there is a deep hatred for Britain and the West. I mean, Peter Hitchens put it very well, because Peter Hitchens, now a very well-known British commentator on the conservative right, but he used to be a Trotskyist. And he said, we were all in favor of open borders and mass immigration. It wasn't because we actually loved immigrants. It was because we hated Britain and we wanted to see its downfall. And I think there's a masochistic element to a lot of this as well. And in a sense, there's also this sort of sense in building on that masochist theme, that we deserve this because of the British Empire, because they believe that the British Empire is the source of so much evil in the world, that we somehow must invite in onto us some form of force to make us pay for what we did. I think that's an element, or there's an element there too.
You've done numerous posts and made numerous comments on the demographic change. How far the last census in the United Kingdom was done in 2021. It's now been 5 years. Talk me briefly through the available data that we have of foreign-born births. And I believe that the last foreign-born birth census that we have for the UK is the late 19th century, the late 1800s, where I think it was about 0.6%.
Well, 1851, 0.5% of the population of Britain were foreign-born. As of 2021, it was 16.6%, and it used to sort of double every 50 years. Now that doubling is happening every 10 years almost, and no society can sustain such rapid change. And so you have these new myths being found. Oh, and 10 million. There are 10 as of 2021. There were 10 million foreign-born people in this country, and 42% of them had arrived within the last decade. But all that data is already 5 years out of date, so it's going to be even higher now. You know, when I was born, London was 85% approximately white British. Today, it's 1/3 white British. And amazingly, 40% of the people living in London weren't even born in this country. No city in human history has had the indigenous population decline so rapidly within the space of a generation. In New York, Toronto have always been to a degree sort of multicultural, but no city has seen such a rapid decline within the space of 25 years. There's this great myth now, of course, being created by our mayors and police commissioners and politicians that Britain's always been multicultural, it's a land of diversity. It's absolute nonsense. I mean, the most we ever had was under the Romans and then the Normans. 3% of this country was foreign-born. We're now at 16%. We've never had anything like this. We've had more immigration in the last 20 years than the last 2,000 years combined, to put that into some perspective. There was a huge controversy in the 1970s when Idi Amin expelled the Ugandan Asians from Uganda. They were part of the British Commonwealth, so they had the right to settle here. There were 28,000 of them coming over, and that caused huge alarm here, that such a large number were coming over, 28,000. We get that number every 3 weeks now. That's what's happened and changed. And so we've had a rapid transformation, and that's one of the reasons why you see this great crackdown on free speech, the loss of some of our civil liberties, etc., is tied into immigration, because the only way you can keep this multiculturalism bandwagon on the road, the only way you can convince people that diversity is a strength, is if you silence the truth tellers. You have to crack down on free speech to prevent those of us willing to stand up and say the emperor has no clothes, because there's no evidence that diversity is a great strength. On the contrary, all the evidence shows us socially, economically, that the more ethnic diversity you have in an area, the less productive, the less happy, the less safe, and the less prosperous those
and the less
areas
volunteering.
become.
Apparently, diverse societies are much less likely to have a culture of volunteering for things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, volunteerism is something very much associated with the West, with the Protestant world particularly. But if you look at there was a very good book written called Bowling Alone in 2004 by a chap called Robert Putnam, an American left-wing academic, and he was shocked by his findings. Increased ethnic diversity on the local level makes you more introverted. You stay home more. You don't engage with your community. You volunteer less. You vote less, but you become more involved in the politics of grievance and victimhood. And because you become more isolated, you don't engage with your community, the local area begins to deteriorate. Buildings begin to deteriorate, and there's a central sense of decay which encourages crime. By every measure, increased ethnic diversity leads to a lowering of social trust. And we also know, for example, that people are less willing to pay welfare when an area is more diverse. So Scandinavia, for example, famous for having the world's best social welfare system, But as they've experienced in Sweden and Denmark, as they've experienced more immigration, people become less willing to pay taxes because it's a human instinct to want to pay money to help people who are like yourselves. And in fact, people believe it's one of the reasons America never had a proper healthcare system, was because they thought perhaps white Americans didn't want to pay taxes to black people for their medical healthcare.
I'd like to point out a certain irony of this conversation is that two products of diversity are raging on against diversity.
Well, it's super diversity. There's a level of diversity which is fine to have, and I think where we were in this country, in Britain, in the 1980s and 90s was fine, But it's like the old adage, a little bit of spice in your soup is nice. Empty the whole pot, and you can't eat it any longer. So none of this is against immigration. This is against mass immigration. This isn't about small elements of diversity. This is about the super diversity we have. The problem is you need to have a majority of the country of the native population, and you need to promote the indigenous culture above all other cultures. And what we've done too long is we've prioritized and promoted minority cultures over the one prevailing British culture, which is what should unite us all together. It is, in an era of identity politics, the one identity you can't celebrate is the one that actually unites everyone together.
Do you feel any form of allegiance to the countries of your ancestors, both on your maternal and on your paternal side?
I never have, and it may be because I don't have two parents of the same background. And that's an interesting point. So my loyalty has always been to Britain.
And you weren't brought up in either of the same way I was not brought up in either of the country of my parents.
No, I was born and raised here. And this is always it's been very simple. That we had a British politician called Lord Tebbit, Norman Tebbit, and he had the cricket test. And he said, which cricket team do you support? Because you have Pakistani or Indian descent people born here who were born in this country, but they support the team of their parents. My view is be proud of your heritage, celebrate those events and days or whatever, but your primary loyalty must be to the country in which you were born and which gave you a good living and a life and everything else. Now, you and I both have Polish heritage, me through my mother.
Poland doesn't have a cricket team.
No, but what's interesting here is I have Polish cousins who were born in this country or born in Canada, and I've asked them, and they say that they are Polish first and British second. And I think that's because they have two Polish parents, and they were brought up in that environment. And I think that has a large part to play there as well.
Interesting.
And you have to think, if that is how Polish people who come from Europe in a Christian culture feel, I mean, I had my great uncle and aunt came here in 1940, and my great uncle, his grandmother was English, Cavendish, first cousin of the Duke of Devonshire. And they lived here 67 years. Picture of the Queen in their living room. They would go to Ascot and Henley and all the English society events, but they never felt that they were English. They loved Britain, and we would be watching a documentary, and he would say to me, "Don't the British make good documentaries?" So after all that time, they still couldn't identify. And then you sort of think, is assimilation actually ever possible? Because here you have Europeans, and if they won't come over properly, then what hope do you have from people who are coming from such radically different, I would say culturally incompatible cultures?
We've talked about demographics. You said that as of 2021, 16.6% of the British population is foreign-born. It's presumably more because it's been 5 years since that census.
Yes.
So we're probably looking at maybe even close to 1 in 5 people, perhaps. The question I have is in a Western country that hasn't seen mass upheaval in living memory, is it possible for the Red-Green Alliance to actually win eventually? Is this a real risk?
Eventually, it absolutely is a risk, and I'll tell you why. And this is an issue which I think is so urgent, and I do not see enough people on the right addressing this. There is a demographic time bomb awaiting us. Right-wing voters are dying off at a far faster rate than left-wing voters. So by 2030, 1.4 million right-wing voters will have died in this country versus 400,000 left-wing voters. And crucially, they're not being replenished amongst the young. So we have the most radically left-wing youth in history. At the last election, if the vote had been restricted to those who were under 30 years of age, there wouldn't have been a single Conservative or right-wing MP elected. It would have been a clean sweep for the left. And also you have to realise that the ethnic minority percentage is strongest amongst the youth. So there's a much larger proportion of the youth or ethnic minorities than for any other age group, understandably. And so you have the most radicalized indigenous British youth ever. So on a whole slew of policy issues, we've never seen the youth of this country holding such views completely out of kilter. So for the first time ever, more youth believe Britain should become a republic than a monarchy. We've never seen that before. More British youth think not causing offence is more important than free speech. So suddenly we're going into this dystopian world where the number one issue, according to the youth of this country, is racism, even though Britain is the world's third least racist country, behind only Sweden and Brazil. So they've been indoctrinated by the education system, media, the culture around them is telling them that Britain is born into racism, the imperial guilt of empire. Pride in Britain has collapsed amongst the young. More people are embarrassed by their culture than proud of it. And then you add in the ethnic minority dimension. And it's easy to see how in the decades ahead that we will be in a situation where you do have that. And so that's why the next couple of elections are crucial. I like to say there's 10 years left really to save Britain, when you can get enough people to vote for parties who can hopefully reverse the long march of the left through our institutions, change the education curriculum, change the training of teachers. 90% of our teachers are left-wing, and hopefully bring some more balance into the upbringing of our youth. Not to have right-wing youth or left, but balanced youth who are taught how to think, not what to think. And if you don't do that, then yes, we do have a very real danger of some sort of red-green alliance.
What do you think is the best solution to the demographic problem in the UK? And by best and most viable solution?
Well, the best and most viable, firstly, are to have a strong government that is committed to policies of mass deportations of illegal immigrants, the denial of citizenship to people who are a burden on the state, the denial of benefits to anybody who is not a British citizen, voluntary remigration, as we see in Sweden and elsewhere, whereby you encourage those people who have British citizenship to leave the country, because we know that 3/5 of people who've come to this country are a net drain on the economy from the moment that they arrive here. By the time the average immigrant gets to pension age, they will have cost around £150,000 each. If they get to 80, they will have cost £464,000. So if you give them, say, £30,000 to leave the country, that actually is an economic, that makes economic sense. It's what the Swedes are doing as well, to encourage people to leave the country. You've got to do that. Look, lots of people believe you should embark upon pro-natalist policies to encourage higher birth rates here. I'm not convinced that's ever going to work in the West. I think that for a variety of reasons, we're not having children any longer. Well, it's a global phenomenon. Outside of Africa and parts of Asia, the birth rate globally is collapsing. It seems very difficult to arrest that.
It's collapsing in Africa as well.
It is, but it's
marginally higher, but it is certainly not the old sort of stereotype of 8 children per woman is no longer true.
But by 2100, 50% of the world's population will be in Africa.
Correct, because there's a delayed. The dropping of birth rates in Africa is delayed in comparison.
You see,
to Russia.
I have a theory. I believe, and I just debated a demographer on this, and we disagree. But I think Poland and Japan will come out of this whole thing as having had the most sensible approach, because right now Poland and Japan are facing a demographic time bomb of a different variety, because they are an inverted pyramid.
Absolutely.
But they have refused to have mass immigration, preserving their culture, prioritizing cultural homogeneity. And because of that, they are much safer, no terrorist attacks, very safe to walk around the streets and so forth. But the debt levels in Japan are huge, and its ranking globally has plummeted. But it just may be, because the big question is, who's going to look after them? Who's going to look after them for the healthcare, for social care, labor shortages? But it just may be that AI, robotics, and job automation will come into their own at just the right moment to actually fulfill all of those roles that's needed. There are already machines that can do open heart surgery. The Sajid Javid, when he was our health minister, he was amazed to see this being performed. He says, "Why don't we have more of these machines?" The doctors' unions won't allow it. But just think of the last 20, 30 years, how far we've come in terms of the internet. We're in the very early stages of AI and robotics. And there's no reason to think in 20, 30 years you won't be able to have robots looking after all of the elderly in Poland and Japan and elsewhere. So Whereas here in the West, I think we're going to face massive job layoffs because of AI and everything else. So we're going to have a huge immigrant population unemployed.
And a low-skilled one. And a mostly low-skilled one.
And on benefits. Yes, so of 3.6 million visas granted to this country recently, only 0.8% were doctors, only 0.6% were scientists and engineers. Yet if you speak to a politician, of course, they will say that economics was the justification for immigration. That has been blasted out of the water completely.
The other thing is I think in terms of demographics, I think obviously preserving cultural homogeneity trumps bringing in, if you're concerned about your country and your country disappearing, bringing in a replacement population, the outcome is the same. Your people disappear in the end, but you've just got a load of foreigners who've replaced you in your own country. I think the one underestimated aspect is just how resourceful humans in general are. You know, so even with an aging population, I strongly believe that people will come together and figure out a solution. In your case, you're saying it's AI and robotics. I also think that there's probably, what ends up happening is if you've got an aging population, slowly but surely dies off, property prices will fall. You eventually get, presumably what will end up happening is as property prices, there's less pressure on the property market, you end up people having more children because it's suddenly easier to afford a place. There's the job market reopens up. Also, there's a mass transfer of wealth from, in that inverted pyramid, all of that money goes down to a lesser amount of people, and eventually those people start having more children again. I do think there's a large amount of, many things are cyclical, and I do think that the other thing is that there is, we've talked about this before, Rafe, and you presented the data and I presented my gut feeling, and you're probably correct and I'm probably wrong, and yet despite this I will still re-argue my case. I'm certainly seeing a very interesting revival amongst my friends and my circle of people of, on one hand, church attendance and church going, which I find very interesting. I was raised Roman Catholic, I am Roman Catholic, and I'm certainly very, very interested in seeing a resurgence specifically of Latin Mass that's become quite, if anything, almost quite fashionable amongst certain circles. And the other thing that I'm seeing is certainly a great interest, the people that I do know who are my age or a little bit younger or a little bit older, a great interest in having not one or two children, but many children. And that is really quite common amongst conservative religious circles. So I do think, and the reason I'm bringing this up specifically at this point of the conversation is this inverted pyramid. I do think that a friend of mine, a South African friend of mine, said something very interesting. They had a farm in what is today Mpumalanga, and they had jackals on their farm, and the jackals were a massive problem, and they'd go out with his father and hunt them. And he said something very interesting. He said that if you didn't kill every single jackal, and you left just a few of them alive, if you missed just a few of them, what would happen is they would breed much faster than ever before. And that population would suddenly, as that pressure on the population increased, the jackal population would suddenly just explode and you'd have an immense problem on your farm. And I know that we were having this conversation in terms of, we were actually discussing having children. That's where he brought up this story of, I brought up this exact point of saying, I have so many friends, they were all talking about having 4, 5, 6 children. And he said, yeah, it sort of reminded him of the jackal story.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, again, I've had this discussion with many people on the right, like yourself, and it just reminds me of sort of Meghan Markle and others on the left talking about their lived experience, because I'm afraid your lived experience isn't the reality of what's happening. You have surrounded yourself quite understandably with very decent folk.
Are you about to blackpill me, Rick?
Who share your views. And yeah, within my world as well, I can name, I'm also Catholic, and it's lovely to see the Catholic revival. But I think too many people on the right are taking Twitter and the Christian nationalism we see growing up in America and elsewhere as being indicative of some broader sweep in society. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. I'm afraid that the increased church attendance people see in this country
Is migration.
is because of migration. It's people coming here from Africa, people coming here from Central and Eastern Europe. That's why there are more bums on pews. In fact, but amongst the British population, there's no evidence that the young British people are becoming more devout at all. On the contrary, the last census shows that for the first time ever, there are more atheists in this country than there are Christians. And the same thing goes with this idea that there's this big right-wing revival amongst males, particularly amongst young men in this country. Again, there's no evidence of that at all. In fact, at the last election, only 24% of votes cast were cast for right-wing parties. 75% of the youth of this country vote for left-wing parties, and that is the biggest demographic, that is the biggest proportion of any age group. So yes, there are, of course, many young conservative men who are much more activist. So you're seeing these people a lot more, but they are still a fringe minority. That's in the terms of right-wing politics, and I'm afraid that's the case for religious observance as well.
Would you say that and amongst the Muslim population, would you say that radicalism is on the rise? Is this data that you've seen or that you...
Yes. So
Could
this
you
is the
tell
other
me
big
about
thing.
that data?
The Muslim youth are far more radical than their parents or grandparents. One of the stats I like to cite on this, which I think is quite remarkable, is that 1/3 of young Muslim youth aged 16 to 24 believe you should be put to death for apostasy, for leaving the faith. It's much smaller than that if you look at their parents or grandparents. Same thing in terms of believing you shouldn't teach music in schools, that girls should have the burqa in schools, and that it should be a criminal offence to show a picture of Muhammad, that it's right to restrict free speech to stop offence against other religions, whether homosexuality should be illegal. On all of those things, far more support for those things amongst the percentage of the youth. Now, it has to be said, 1/3 is still a minority, right? So there are some things which a majority of Muslims believe which should alarm us. A majority of Muslims believe that you should be criminalized for showing a picture of Muhammad. A majority believe in restricting free speech. A majority believe being gay should be illegal, compared to only 5% in the broader population. But for other things, anti-Semitism and so forth, it's not a majority. But too often people say, oh, it's only a fringe minority who hold these views. It's not a fringe minority. It's a very large minority, around a quarter, 15% in the latest poll have a favorable view of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so forth. So if you're talking about, I mean, one poll I saw, 9% of Muslims believed that they were supported or identified as being jihadis or extremists. 9% is 400,000 people. We have 40,000 Muslims on the terror watch list in this country, kept by MI5. 40,000 people, to put that into context, that's the size of Hamas. That's larger than Hamas on October the 7th when they went into Israel. It's larger than the size of the ISIS army in 2014 in Iraq. That's who we have here. It's half the size of the full-time British army. And when you look at the fact that the Muslim population is forecast to double, perhaps even treble by 2050, that means you're going to have 120,000 people on the terror watch list, which is larger than the British army, and you're going to have perhaps over 1 million people in this country who identify as being jihadis, which is actually larger than the American army.
We're going to be filming in Tower Hamlets, which is famous for all the wrong reasons. Is there anything you could tell me about Tower Hamlets, Rafe?
Tower Hamlets is one of the most corrupt places in Europe, I would say. It's run by radical Bangladeshi and South Asian Muslims. The mayor there has got a criminal record
For corruption, specifically.
For corruption specifically. And it's actually indicative of what's happening around the country. Britain has imported the politics of Pakistan into this country. Rampant corruption, nepotism, intimidation. I mean, we've seen in the last general election, we had firebombing of MPs' offices. We had MPs cowering in their offices in Parliament, having panic alarm buttons put into their offices. Because of the people that they had invited in. As it says in Hosea, ye who reap, sow the wind shall reap the whirlwind. And they invited in these people. And what you're seeing now also, the last few elections, is rampant corruption through postal voting. And so what's happening is you have Muslim leaders, gang leaders and others who basically insist that you apply for a postal vote, and then they will come around to your house and collect your postal vote. All you need to do is just sign it and give them the blank postal vote. And then vast tranches of these postal votes were then given to the Labour Party, probably now given to the Green Party. And this is one of the most rampant elements of corruption in this country, which not enough attention is being given to. In the 19th century, we famously had rotten boroughs in England, which were corrupt boroughs. We are, Britain is, after Greece, the land of democracy. And to think that we have now imported into this country such practices where you have rampant corruption taking place, intimidation and vote harvesting on a massive scale. I mean, this is a criminal enterprise, and yet the police and the political class don't want to focus attention on it.
Well, Rafe, thank you so much. It was illuminating, very black-pilling as always.
Yeah, sorry to be so depressing whenever we meet.
And I'm hoping we'll have yet another follow-up after this. Thank you so much for your time, Rafe. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Stefan.